Chapter 8 of The Circular Staircase. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ian Skillen, Glasgow. The Circular Staircase by Mary Roberts Rinehart. Chapter 8. The Other Half of the Line. "Miss Innes," the detective began, "what is your opinion of the figure you saw on the east veranda the night you and your maid were in the house alone?" "It was a woman," I said positively. "And yet your maid affirms with equal positiveness that it was a man." "Nonsense," I broke in. "Liddy has her eyes shut. She always shuts them when she's frightened." "And you never thought, then, that the intruder who came later that night might be a woman? The woman, in fact, whom you saw on the veranda?" "I had reasons for thinking it was a man," I said, remembering the pearl cufflink. "Now we're getting down to business. What were your reasons for thinking that?" I hesitated. "If you've any reason for believing that your midnight guest was Mr. Armstrong, other than his visit here the other night, you ought to tell me, Miss Innes. We can take nothing for granted. If, for instance, the intruder had dropped the bar and scratched the staircase, you see I know about that. If this visitor was a woman, why should not the same woman have come back the following night, met Mr. Armstrong in the circular staircase, and, in alarm, shot him?" "It was a man," I reiterated, and then, because I could think of no other reason for my statement, I told him about the pearl cufflink. He was intensely interested. "Will you give me the link?" he said, when I finished. "Or at least let me see it. I consider it a most important clue." "Won't the description do?" "Not as well as the original." "Well, I'm very sorry," I said, as calmly as I could. "The thing is lost. It must have fallen out of a box on my dressing table." Whatever he thought of my explanation, and I knew he doubted it, he made no sign. He asked me to describe the link accurately, and I did so, while he glanced at a list he took from his pocket. "One set of monogram cufflinks," he read. "One set plain pearl links, one set cufflinks. Woman's head set with diamonds and emeralds." There is no mention of such a link as you describe, and yet, if your theory is right, Mr. Armstrong must have taken back in his cuffs one complete cufflink, and a half, perhaps, of the other. The idea was new to me. If it had not been the murdered man who had entered the house that night, who had it been? "There are a number of strange things connected with this case," the detective went on. "Miss Gertrude Innes testified that she heard someone fumbling with the lock, that the door opened, and that almost immediately the shot was fired. Now, Miss Innes, here is the strange part of that. Mr. Armstrong had no key with him. There was no key in the lock or on the floor. In other words, the evidence points absolutely to this: Mr. Armstrong was admitted from the house from within." "It is impossible," I broke in. "Mr. Jamieson, do you not know what your words imply? Do you not know that you are practically accusing Gertrude Innes of admitting that man?" "Not quite that," he said, with his friendly smile. "In fact, Miss Innes, I am quite certain she did not. But as long as I learn only parts of the truth from both of you and her, what can I do? I know you picked up something in the flower bed. You refused to tell me what it was. I know Miss Gertrude went back to the billiard room to get something. She refuses to say what. You suspect what happened to the cufflink, but you won't tell me. So far, all I am sure of is this: I do not believe Arnold Armstrong was the midnight visitor who so alarmed you by dropping, shall we say, a golf stick. And I believe that when he did come, he was admitted by someone in this house. Who knows? It may have been Liddy." I stirred my tea angrily. "I have always heard," I said dryly, "that undertakers' assistants are jovial young men. A man's sense of humour seems to be in inverse proportion to the gravity of his profession." "A man's sense of humour is a barbarous and a cruel thing, Miss Innes," he admitted. "It is to the feminine as the hug of a bear is to the scratch of well, anything with claws. "Is that you, Thomas? Come in." Thomas Johnson stood in the doorway. He looked alarmed and apprehensive, and suddenly I remembered the sealskin dressing bag in the lodge. Thomas came just inside the door, stood with his head drooping, his eyes under their shaggy grey brows fixed on Mr. Jamieson. "Thomas," said the detective, not unkindly, "I sent for you to tell us what you told Sam Bohannon at the club the day before Mr. Arnold was found here dead. Let me see, you came here Friday night to see Miss Innes, didn't you? And came to work here on Saturday morning?" For some unexplained reason, Thomas looked relieved. "Yes, sir," he said. "You see, it was like this. When Mr. Armstrong and the family went away, Miss Watson and me, we was left in charge till the place was rented. Miss Watson, she'd been here a good while, and she was scary, so she slept in the house. I'd been having tokens to Miss Innes, some of them, and I slept in the lodge. Then one day Miss Watson, she came to me and she says, Thomas, you'll have to sleep up in the big house. I'm too nervous to do it anymore. But I just reckoned to myself that if it's too scary for her, it's too scary for me. We had it then, sure enough, and we ended up with Miss Watson staying in the lodge nights and me looking for work at the club." "Did Miss Watson say that anything had happened to alarm her?" "No, sir. She was just naturally scared. Well, that was all, far as I know, until the night I came over to see Miss Innes. I come across the valley, down the path from the clubhouse, and I goes home that way. Down in the creek bottom, I almost run into a man. He was standing with his back to me, and he was working one of these here electric light things that fit in your pocket. He was having trouble. One minute it'd flash out, and the next it'd be gone. I had a view of his white dress shirt and tie as I passed, but I didn't see his face. But I know it wasn't Mr. Arnold. It was a taller man than Mr. Arnold. Besides that, Mr. Arnold was playing cards when I got to the clubhouse, same as he'd been doing all day." "And the next morning you came back along the path?" pursued Mr. Jamieson relentlessly. "The next morning I came back along the path and down where I done see the man night before I picked up this here." The old man held out a shiny object, and Mr. Jamieson took it. He held it on his extended palm for me to see. It was the other half of the pearl cufflink. But Mr. Jamieson was not quite through questioning him. "So you showed it to Sam at the club, and asked him if he knew anyone who owned such a link, and Sam said what?" "Well, Sam, he allowed he'd seen such a pair of cuff buttons and a shirt belonging to Mr. Bailey, Mr. Jack Bailey, sir." "I'll keep this link, Thomas, for a while," the detective said. "That's all I wanted to know. Good night." As Thomas shuffled out, Mr. Jamieson watched me sharply. "You see, Miss Innes," he said, "Mr. Bailey insists on mixing himself for this thing. If Mr. Bailey came here that Friday night expecting to meet Arnold Armstrong and missed him, if, as I say, he had done this, might he not, seeing him entering the following night, have struck him down as he'd intended before?" "But the motive," I gasped. "Oh, there could be motive proved, I think. Arnold Armstrong and John Bailey have been enemies since the latter, as cashier of the Traders' Bank, brought Arnold almost into the clutches of the law. Also, you forget that both men have been paying attention to Miss Gertrude. Bailey's flight looks bad too." "And you think Halsey helped him to escape?" "Oh, undoubtedly. Why, what could it be but flight? Miss Innes, let me reconstruct that evening as I see it. Bailey and Armstrong had quarrelled at the club. I learned this today. Your nephew brought Bailey over. Prompted by jealous, insane fury, Armstrong followed, coming across by the path. He entered the billiard-room wing, perhaps rapping, perhaps being admitted by your nephew. Just inside he was shot by someone on the circular staircase. The shot fired, your nephew and Bailey left the house at once, going towards the automobile house. They left by the lower road, which prevented them being heard, and when you and Miss Gertrude got downstairs, everything was quiet." "But Gertrude's story," I stammered. "Miss Gertrude only brought forward their explanation the following morning. I do not believe it, Miss Innes. It's the story of a loving and ingenious woman." "And this thing tonight?" It may upset my whole view of the case. We must give the benefit of every doubt, after all. We may, for instance, come back to the figure in the porch. If it was a woman you saw that night through the window, we might start with other premises. Or Mr. Innes's explanation may turn us in a new direction. It's possible that he shot Arnold Armstrong as a burglar and then fled, frightened at what he had done. In any case, however, I feel confident that the body was here when he left. Mr. Armstrong left the club ostensibly for a moonlight saunter about half after 11 o'clock. It was 3 when the shot was fired. I leaned back bewildered. It seemed to me that the evening had been full of significant happenings. Had I only held the key? Had Gertrude been the fugitive in the clothes chute? Who was the man on the drive near the lodge, and whose gold-mounted dressing bag had I seen in the lodge sitting-room? It was late when Mr. Jamieson finally got up to go. I went with him to the door, and together we stood looking out over the valley. Below lay the village of Casanova, with its old-world houses, its blossoming trees, and its peace. Above on the hill across the valley were the lights of the Greenwood Club. It was even possible to see the curving row of parallel lights that marked the carriage road. Rumours that I'd heard about the club come back, of drinking, of high play, and once, a year ago, of a suicide under those very lights. Mr. Jamieson left, taking a short cut to the village, and I still stood there. It must have been after 11, and the monotonous tick of the big clock on the stairs behind me was the only sound. Then I was conscious that someone was running up the drive. In a minute, a woman darted into the area of light made by the open door and caught me by the arm. It was Rosie. Rosie in a state of collapse from terror, and not the least important, clutching one of my Coalport plates and a silver spoon. She stood staring into the darkness behind, still holding the plate. I got her into the house and secured the plate, then I stood and looked down at her, where she crouched tremblingly against the doorway. "Well?" I asked. "Didn't your young man enjoy his meal?" She couldn't speak. She looked at the spoon she still held. I wasn't so anxious about it, thank heaven, it wouldn't chip. And then she stared at me. "I appreciate your desire to have everything nice for him," I went on, "but the next time you might take them in Limoges china. It's more easily duplicated and less expensive." "I haven't a young man, not here." She'd got her breath back now, as I'd guessed she would. I've been chased by a thief, Miss Innes." "Did he chase you out of the house and back again?" I asked. Then Rosie began to cry, not silently, but noisily, hysterically. I stopped her by giving her a good shake. "What in the world's the matter with you?" I snapped. "Has the day of good common sense gone by? Sit up and tell me the whole thing." Rosie sat up then and sniffed. I was coming down the drive," she began. "You must start with when you went down the drive, with my dishes and my silver," I interrupted. But seeing more signs of hysteria, I gave it. Very well, very well. You were coming up the drive. I had a basket of silver and dishes in my arm. I was carrying the plate because I was afraid I'd break it. And part way up the road, a man stepped out of the bushes. And he held his arm like this. It spread out. I couldn't get past. And he said, 'Not so fast, young lady. I want you to let me see what's in that basket.' She got up in her excitement and took hold of my arm. 'It was like this, Miss Innes,' she said, 'and say you was the man. When I said that, I screamed and I ducked under his arm like this. He caught at the basket and I dropped it. I ran as fast as I could, and he came after me as far as the trees, then he stopped. Oh, Miss Innes, it must have been the man that killed Mr. Armstrong.' 'Don't be foolish,' I said. 'Whoever killed Mr. Armstrong would put as much space between himself and this house as he could. Go up to bed now, and mind, if I hear this story being repeated to the other maids, I shall deduct from your wages for every broken dish I find in the drive.' I listened to Rosie as she went upstairs, running past the shadowy places and slamming her door. Then I sat down and looked at the Coalport plate and the silver spoon. I'd brought my own china and silver, and from all appearances I would have little enough to take back. But though I might jeer at Rosie as much as I wished, the fact remained that Someone had been in the drive that night who had no business there, although neither had Rosie for that matter. I could fancy Liddy's face when she missed the extra pieces of china. She had opposed Rosie from the start. If Liddy once finds a prophecy fulfilled, especially an unpleasant one, she never allows me to forget it. It seemed to me it was absurd to leave that china dotted along the road for her to spy the next morning, so with a sudden resolution I opened the door again and stepped out into the darkness. As the door closed behind me, I half regretted my impulse. Then I shut my teeth and went on. I've never been a nervous woman, as I said before. Moreover, a minute or two in the darkness enabled me to see things fairly well. Beulah gave me rather a start by rubbing unexpectedly against my feet. Then we two, side by side, went down the drive. There were no fragments of china, but where the grove began, I picked up a silver spoon. So far, Rosie's story was borne out. I began to wonder if it were not indiscreet, to say the least, this midnight prowling in a neighbourhood with such a deservedly bad reputation. Then I saw something gleaming, which proved to be the handle of a cup, and a step or two further on I found a V-shaped bit of a plate. But the most surprising thing of all was to find the basket sitting comfortably beside the road, with the rest of the broken crockery piled neatly within, and a handful of small silver spoons, forks, and the like on top. I could only stand and stare. So Rosie's story was true. But where had Rosie carried her basket? And why had the thief, if he were a thief, picked up the broken china out of the road and left it with his booty? It was with my nearest approach to a nervous collapse that I heard the familiar throbbing of an automobile engine. As it came closer, I recognized the outline of the dragonfly and knew that Halsey had come back. Strange enough it must have seemed to Halsey, too, to come across me in the middle of the night, with the skirt of my grey silk gown over my shoulders to keep off the dew, holding a red and green basket under one arm and a black cat under the other. What with relief and joy, I began to cry right there, and very nearly wiped my eyes on Beulah in the excitement. End of chapter 8 of The Circular Staircase, read by Ian Skillen.